Welcome to the Microsoft DevOps user group. This user group has been around since the fall of 2017. I'm your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and we have today an exciting presenter, Abel Wang, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But the user group, the Microsoft DevOps user group, we're almost 200 members already after only been around for a few months. So that proves the interest and the need for a purely Microsoft DevOps community. This group is for software professionals working on the Microsoft platform who wish to explore, implement, and learn DevOps. This group embraces cloud, and as such will bring in the best presenters for each topic, regardless of location, while live streaming all of the content. And this group recognizes the technical practices included in the DevOps handbook, that yellow book, and we encourage members to read this book. From a technology perspective, we seek to implement these practices on Visual Studio-based software, leveraging Visual Studio Team services and complementary extensions, and running on Azure or on Windows Server anywhere. So we'll record and post all the content so you can look for past presentations on the Meetup website, all running from YouTube. Next month, some highlights. June 19th, we'll have Ryan Rousseau and Bob Walker presenting on automated software deployments with Octopus Deploy. And another upcoming presentation we already have booked, August, will be Jessica Dean from Microsoft presenting on automated deployments with Kubernetes and Azure. And as we go through here, if you have any ideas for content or topics or presenters, please reach out on the Meetup group, start a discussion, and we'll try to get the best content for helping implement and adopting all of the DevOps methods that our industry is learning about on your Visual Studio-based software running on Windows. So today, as we go through our presentation, I encourage you to ask questions. There's a Q&A window that you can see in the software, and there's also a chat, and put those in there. Abel will stop during the presentation a couple of times and ask for questions, and also we'll have just a couple of minutes of questions at the end. If we do have any questions that are not answered by the end of the time, which is about 55 minutes, then we'll make sure to get those answers posted on the Meetup group. So without further ado, now on to feature flags. I'm really excited to introduce Abel Wang. He is a senior cloud developer advocate specializing in DevOps and Azure with a background in application development. He is currently part of Donovan Brown's League of Extraordinary Cloud DevOps Advocates. And before joining Microsoft, Abel spent 7 years as a process consultant and a certified Scrum Master, helping customers globally develop solutions using agile practices and Team Foundation Server. Prior to that, Abel founded and sold his own software company. When not working, Abel is either writing code, yes, that's what he does for fun, playing his guitar, or training for the Great Wall Marathon. So without further ado, so excited to introduce Abel Wang. Take it away, Abel.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I am super excited today to talk about feature flags. I am very passionate about feature flags. I'm a firm believer that they are one of the things that absolutely help enable DevOps at speed. I'll even go so far as to say that I don't think you can really do DevOps at speed without feature flags. But then my boss, Donovan Brown, he kind of loses his mind because he's like, well, technically you can, but it's so much easier with feature flags. So before we begin, though, I wanted to do a quick intro. Jeff did a great intro for me, but I am a senior cloud developer advocate, right? And that's a super wonderful title. It's big and long and fancy, but what do I really do, right? I write code, that's what I do. I eat, drink, live writing code. It totally, utterly defines everything about me, right? I kind of pretty much don't have a life except for writing code. It's what makes me happy. I'm that weird dude at Microsoft where after a really long day of writing code, I go home to relax. I make dinner with my wife. I play with our dog. We watch some TV, and while the TV's on, I pull my laptop out and I start writing more code because that's what I love to do. The other fun thing, some fun things about me. I am a runner. I definitely want to run on the Great Wall Marathon. One of these days, I'll finally get to do it. I'm training pretty hard for it, and I hear it's like the third hardest marathon in the world, so I think I need to run a couple more before I try to tackle that one, because I don't want to be this guy right here in the red in the middle of the wall throwing up. Right? So definitely don't want to be that guy. Some other fun thing is back in the day, I used to be a real life rock star. But apparently I wasn't very good, or I wasn't good enough, because here I am talking to a bunch of people from Austin about DevOps instead of playing the guitar. So there's that as well. I am on Donovan Brown's team. We are a team of 5 DevOps practitioners that span dev all the way to ops, right? So I'm definitely on the dev end of the spectrum. I sling code, that's who I am, that's what I do. Our charter, our sole charter, is to help enable people to get into Azure using DevOps best practices, right? I want everyone to use Visual Studio Team Services, but you don't have to, really. Azure is an open platform, and whatever tooling that you want to use, our job is to help everyone use DevOps best practices to get into Azure, right? So if you have any type of DevOps questions, tweet at us, use the hashtag LOECDA, and that will literally light up a team room on all of our computers, and immediately we will descend on that question, try to answer it for you, and if we can't answer it, we will find the right people at Microsoft that can, right? So if you need to reach out and have any questions at all, we are there for you on Twitter to help. All right, so on to today's topic, which is feature flags. What exactly are feature flags? Well, feature flags, they're a software technique that enables you to turn on or off certain portions of your code during your runtime, right? So if you have feature flags, you'll be able to turn features on and off, and the different branches of your code, it gets to go through the different branches of code as well. And really, it's a glorified if statement. I mean, we can try to make it really fancy, but at the end of the day, it's a if statement. And by having these feature flags, what you end up doing is in one deployment, you can now ship alternative code paths. So during runtime, that's when you can pick which path you want to go to, right? Very, very powerful to have this, because now you have made your deployments of your features independent of your physical deployment itself. So in one physical deployment, you can ship multiple features and turn them on or off whenever you want to. And I know I called this a glorified if statement, but that's kind of silly, because I really should just call it an if statement, because it's a freaking if statement, right? All right, so it's nothing more special than an if statement. But because it's an if statement, if you think about if you're going to start adding feature flags into your app, you're adding complexity, right? You're adding depth by adding all of these if statements sprinkled throughout your code. So the big question is why, right? Why would you want to add this extra layer of complexity into your application? And the answer is because DevOps, right? So what exactly is DevOps? DevOps is the union of people, process, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to our end users. And like what we always say, you know, the key part of that is we want to be able to continuously deliver value. And feature flags, that's a technique that allows us to move much faster and push code into production faster, yet still safer, right? So a perfect example of this is if you look at some really large enterprises like Netflix or Etsy or Amazon or even Microsoft, right? Where we're deploying code multiple times per day. And have you ever thought about like, wait, how are they able to do that without creating complete and utter chaos, right? If you're deploying multiple times a day, how are they not just introducing bugs everywhere? How are things not breaking all the time? And the answer is, well, there's a lot of answers. One of them is there's a massive amount of unit tests that's run everywhere, but a key part of this is the use of feature flags, right? So feature flags, that's what helps enable us to move much faster, and also much safer. So I always talk about Microsoft because that's the company that I come from. But I want to make sure that I'm pretty clear that when I talk about Microsoft, I'm not talking about the entire organization. The way that Microsoft is set up, we have every group does things their own way, right? Whichever way they need to function. So the Windows groups is very different from the Office group, which is vastly different than the VSTS group, all the way down to like the Bing groups and so on and so forth, right? So when I talk, usually I'm only talking about the Visual Studio Team Services group because that's the group that I'm with, and that's the one that I really know about. And many years ago, we made this DevOps transformation, right? Where we went from a very waterfall type company and product where we delivered a new version of TFS once every 3 to 4 years, all the way to today where we are extremely agile, right? Where every 3 weeks, like clockwork, we're pushing new features out into production, like clockwork. We never miss, right? It's like clockwork. What we don't tell people, but I think we should, is that every single day, 2 times a day, we're pushing bug fixes out into production as well, every single day. So depending on the branch of code that I'm in, my changes could reach production on that very same day, right? So how do we make sure there's no chaos and just complete disasters happening all the time? Feature switches, right? Feature flags. That's one of the things that we've done that really helps us move at speed. There are other groups at Microsoft that move at a much slower pace, for instance, the Windows and the Office teams. I think there's a lot more legacy there, so they don't quite move. Well, they're at different points in their DevOps journey. But then you look at a team like Bing, and I know we all like to make fun of Bing, but they are probably the most DevOps advanced team that I've ever met. They push out hundreds of times a day. And every developer check-in does end up reaching production, assuming it flows through the pipeline and it passes all the unit tests and so on and so forth, right? But it's absolutely spectacular to see how they do things. And at that type of exaggerated pace, it really shows the power of feature flags, right? So what does feature flags do that helps us enable to move at speed? And one of the biggest things that it does is it helps enable trunk-based development. So what you see at the picture right now, that's a slide that kind of it's a typical branching scheme when you don't have feature flags and you have long-running branches. And there's a lot of organizations that use branching patterns that are like this. Another one is like using Git flow, and they're highly complex branching schemes, and they serve a purpose, right? Because they isolate the code from the branches. But anytime you have long-running branches, it turns into a maintenance nightmare, right? So to have long-running branches, not only do you have to maintain massive amounts of developer discipline, but anytime you have to merge, when that merge happens, a merge bomb explodes, right? Code conflicts occur. It becomes extremely difficult to merge your code back in, and things slow way down when you have to start merging things back together again. So in my world, long-running branches are really bad. I want to basically dev right off of my master. I can create a super short-lived feature branch, and then I want to merge that code back in, right? So people oftentimes will then ask me, well, what if you're not done with your particular feature or your particular user story? You can't merge back into master, and then potentially that may take you a couple of weeks, and then your code gets out of sync, and when you try to merge, the bomb goes off again, right? The answer to that is at Microsoft on the VSTS team, what we end up doing is any new feature that we write is wrapped up in a feature switch. So it's hidden behind this if statement. So very quickly, we can merge that into the master branch, but guess what? Nobody sees it because it's hidden behind that feature switch. Right? So this becomes incredibly powerful. So now we more or less, we can dev straight off of master. We don't have to worry about the merge problems because everything is constantly done inside of master. There's very little merging that needs to happen, right? And this saves massive amounts of time. I can't iterate enough just how much time this saves our group. So to give you a sense of scope, the VSTS team, we have about 500 developers with about 50 teams. Each team is about 10 people. We're spread across 3 continents, and we all work out of master, right? Not multiple repos, one repo off of master doing trunk-based development. And that is one of the reasons why we're able to move at the rate that we are, is because we're doing that. And it's almost impossible to do that without feature flags. All right, so another reason where feature flags become incredibly useful is that by using feature flags, we have the ability to do experiments. And by that, I mean, you can have 2 different features, variation A and variation B, and you can start routing some of your traffic through one feature and the rest of your traffic into the other feature, and start seeing which one is working better, right? So when you start moving at DevOps speed, one of the most useful parts of DevOps is that we're iterating extremely quickly so that we can run experiments. Every single feature that we develop, basically we're guessing, right? We're guessing if it's needed by our end users or if it's useful for our end users. We can talk to the product owner and they can even tell us that this is what they need and this is the most important thing in the world. But we all know that the game completely changes when something goes live and real people are actually using the product itself, right? That's when you really know, is this useful or not? So we're constantly doing experiments. That's the power of DevOps speed, right? You're iterating quickly. You can do lots of experiments. And what we have found out at Microsoft through countless iterations and through countless amounts of product is that when we're doing these experiments, about a third of them are successful, right? Third of them, guess what? We guessed correctly. This is an extremely useful feature. People love it and they're all about it, right? About a third of them, our end users are kind of like, whatever. They don't care one way or the other. It doesn't affect the dial in any way, shape, or form. And then a third of them are complete and utter failures, right? Where we thought this was a great feature, we added it in there, and not only do people not want to use it, they're like, we don't even want to use your product anymore because this feature is so bad, right? So no matter how often we do these experiments, third of them are successful, third of them ambivalent, and third of them really, really bad. So by looking at these results of these experiments, we are now able to double down on the type of stuff that is successful so that our experiment rates, they're far higher now than just the 30%, right? And this way we can start moving faster with even more success. And this is vital. If you want to move at DevOps speed, it is vital that you are able to run these type of experiments, and having feature flags makes running these experiments incredibly easy. I can't even begin to describe how much easier it is to do this with feature flags as opposed to having multiple branches of code that you're trying to push and maintain as well. All right, so oops, jumped a little too fast. Another benefit of using feature flags that makes deploying so much faster is that you're able to use feature flags to do what is called safe deployment. To give you a very exaggerated view of safe deployment, what that means is when you deploy your application, your new features out, you don't deploy it to absolutely everybody because you potentially could be introducing a bug or potentially bad things could happen with your rollout, right? So you want to be able to incrementally roll your feature out to people slowly. In this way, you can gather analytics as it's being rolled out to decide, you know what, is this good or not? And then you can slowly start opening it up to more and more people. So we use this concept of safe deployment on the Visual Studio Team Services team when we deploy Visual Studio Team Services, right? So VSTS is a global, is a service that services the entire world. So when we push out new features every 3 weeks, like clockwork, we don't just blast new code out to every single user everywhere, right? That would be incredibly dangerous. If one person had some bad code, we could end up bringing VSTS down completely for every single user. And that's people's source code, right? That's their work that they're doing. We can't go down. So VSTS is one of those types of services that has to have zero downtime. So because of that, we do safe deployment, where we deploy it through these multiple rings. And we first deploy to ring 0. And ring 0, that's just us, that's just engineering. We actually use VSTS in-house to do all of our work and do all of our builds, do all of our everything inside of VSTS as well. So we deploy it first to the engineering team. And when it's deployed to the engineering team, we're using it. And it bakes in our environment for about 48 hours. And during that time frame, we're gathering analytics and we're gathering user feedback. And if things are bad or if things, too many alerts are happening, bam, we stop that deployment completely. But if it passes through our environment for 48 hours and everything's okay, we deploy to ring 1. And it turns out ring 1 happens to be Brazil. Why Brazil? Did they win the lottery or lose the lottery, depending on how you want to look at it? Brazil, because they are the smallest scale unit that we have, so it affects the least amount of users. So once again, the app, the new features will bake in the Brazil ring for 24 to 48 hours. While it's there, analytics is being gathered. We're paying close attention to our Brazilian users, seeing if we get any feedback, good or bad. And if there are bad feedback, or if the analytics show something and the monitoring shows stuff, we can stop that deployment and immediately roll stuff back. And then so on and so forth, right? We keep on doing this until we reach, I think, ring 6, which ends up being the rest of the world. So that's the concept of safe deployment. And you can do the exact same thing using feature flags. So you can have a flag for a new feature, but only turn it on for maybe 5% of your users. And then if all of that looks good, you can turn it on maybe now for 10%, 20%, and incrementally roll out your new feature to everybody. So if something bad happens, you're not affecting everyone all at once. Right? All right, so safe deployment, feature flags makes it really, really easy to do. And I'll show you in a little bit how you can set that up. And the final reason on why you would want to use feature flags is because rollback or removing a feature becomes incredibly simple, right? You flip your switch from on to off, and guess what? You're done. That's it. There's nothing more you need to do. So I am constantly being asked, especially back when I was doing consulting, where people would ask me, we just pushed out feature A, feature B, and feature C, and we love feature B and we love feature C, but feature A, not so much. Is there any way you can roll that out? And before using feature switches, the answer would be, not really. And they're like, you mean you can't cherry pick your change sets and just pull out that portion? And the answer still is, nah, not really, right? Because it's kind of like having that cup of coffee where somebody threw sugar in it, and I hand it to you, and then you tell me, I love this coffee, but can you pull the sugar back out? And the answer is, well, sort of, kind of, right? I can, I guess, boil it again and capture the liquid and separate out the solid, and eventually you're left with something that's sort of kind of coffee, but not quite the same, right? So the answer, of course, back then was, don't add the sugar if you're not going to drink it, or if you're not going to eat it, right, in your coffee. But with the advent of feature flags, this becomes incredibly easy, because now all you have to do is flip the switch off for that particular feature, and guess what? Bam, you're done. So you absolutely can take the sugar out of your coffee now. And the other thing, of course, is if your deployment, maybe you deploy 10 new features, and all of a sudden performance starts getting really slow, or you start noticing a lot of alerts for the people that you turn them on. Guess what? You flip the switch for all of them, and you've effectively rolled back. There's nothing more that you need to do. You don't need to push new code out. Remember, this is all done at runtime, right? So those are the reasons why I freaking love feature flags, because they give me the ability to move at a much faster pace than if I didn't have feature flags. And it allows me to do things that I can't do if I didn't have feature flags. So the next thing that I wanted to do was basically show you guys how to implement feature flags in a real world application. So the idea behind feature flags, or implementing feature flags, is you need to store the value of your flags somewhere, right? Some people use their web config, some people stick it in a database and have an API that they build on top of it to pull those values out. I use a service called Launch Darkly, just because they work so incredibly well. But however you want to implement your feature flags is up to you. But for this demo, I'm going to show everything using Launch Darkly. All right, so here's my application. It's a web app. Nothing really special about it. It's just, this is a web app that my team uses. But the UI looks incredibly ugly, right? It literally is the template coming from .NET Core. Just the template, we slap some info on it, and that's it. So we wanted to put a new user interface on it and kind of tweak some of these pages so that this website would look better. So if we go ahead and jump into our feature flag, and like I said, I'm using Launch Darkly to hold all of my feature flags. Here's my new UI. I can go ahead and turn that on. And I can go back to my code. I can refresh this. And with no compilation at all, it's just going to go ahead and reload a bunch of style sheets for me and reload my new interface, and bam, a completely new user interface shows up. Right? So this means I've changed my database, I've changed my web front end, and I've also changed my middle tier logic as well. So how do you do this in your code? Right? So this is a fascinating thing. It's so simple to do. Let me go ahead and set a breakpoint. It literally is an if statement. So I hit my index from my home page. I'm checking my Launch Darkly client, and I'm saying for the temp new UI, for this particular user, is it on or off? And you'll see that it is turned on. So it goes ahead and loads my new page, right? And if I go ahead and turn my feature flag off, let's turn it off. And we go back in and refresh. It falls into the else. And then our page loads, and it's the old UI, right? And all the old calls as well. So I wasn't kidding when I said it's super easy to implement. Feature flags, nothing more than an if statement. If you can write an if statement, you can write a feature flag. So a lot of times when I'm talking to customers, I ask them if they're using feature flags, and they're like, oh, I understand the benefits of it, but we just haven't done it yet. We have to re-architect. Our application is not architected in such a way to allow feature flags. There's so much work that we'd have to do. We just don't have time to get things ready for it. And my response to that is, there's nothing for you to re-architect, right? No matter what state your application is, your very next feature, you can easily wrap that in a feature flag. So creating feature flags and creating these if statements, that's really, really easy to do, right? The hard part is not creating the feature flags. The hard part with feature flags is cleaning up, is maintaining your feature flags so that you don't incur massive amounts of debt and your code just turns into a giant mess, right? So that's the hard part. And of course, we'll jump in a little bit more to talk about best practices and things that you can do to make sure that you're able to clean up in an easy fashion. So in a nutshell, feature flags, it's just a freaking if statement. So a lot of times people ask me, okay, that's great, but this your example, it shows what you can do for your code, but what about for your user interface? Can you use feature flags for your user interface? And the answer is absolutely can. And there's a couple different approaches that you can do. So I have my old UI page and my new UI page, and I'm actually routing them depending on the logic of my if statement. I'm routing to them to different views. And so my different views will hold completely, will hold a view with the feature turned on and then one without the feature at all, right? So that's one way of doing that, where you can route them to completely different views. And I'm kind of a big fan of this because this allows me to easily write unit tests to test to make sure that I'm routing to the right pages, right? So that's one way of doing it. But there are times when you can't route, right? So is there a way inside of your views or inside of your UI layout code where you could route or turn features on and off? And the answer is absolutely you can. So inside my layout page, there are some places that I need to turn these feature flags on and off. So if the new UI is turned on, then I actually do this chunk of code. And if you notice, I even have nested flags as well. So if I have the select new profile turned on, then it's going to add this chunk of code in. And of course, if my new UI is turned off, it routes it through this chunk of HTML code, right? So you absolutely have the ability to add feature flags into your UI elements as well. Some other people have asked me, okay, well, what if I'm writing a mobile app or that uses XAML? Or what if I'm using a desktop application? Can you still do that for UI elements? And my question always is there the ability to add an if statement? Because if there is, you absolutely can. Because remember, it's nothing more than an if statement. Right? All right, so I'm looking at the question panel really quickly. It doesn't look like anybody has questions yet. If you do have questions, feel free to ask at any point in time. I will stop periodically to look, and also Jeff will ping me if you guys have questions as well. So the other thing that I wanted to show, and let me take this out of debug mode, is you can make your code a little bit cleaner, right? Because right now, if you look at my controller has to have knowledge about the infrastructure that I use to hold my feature flags. And that just kind of makes things a little bit messy. And also, right now, it ties any place that I want to apply this new UI or this particular feature, or that's in this particular flag, everything is just tied into this chunk of code, right? So that does become a little bit messy. So what we can do is we can create a feature flag decision object, and we can do some abstraction, right? So in this abstraction, I can pass in my client. I can, depending on the user, I can now call my launch likely client to say, should I turn this on or off for a new UI? Or even better, what I could do is I can actually have a call. Should I apply this new UI to the index page and also the about page? Because maybe I want to do these separately, right? So in this fashion, it adds a layer of abstraction where it makes my code just a tiny bit cleaner, right? So of course I can jump into here. I can do something like, instead of this, we could say this dot feature flag decisions dot Halloween style new UI page, and I can pass in my user. Let me copy and paste this because I am too lazy to type all of that. So if we do something like this, that gives us a one layer of abstraction. So now my controller page doesn't have a reference to the infrastructure surrounding how I actually store and use my flags, right? So that cleans it up a little bit. Another thing that you guys might be noticing as well is, well, this is great and all, but I still have this if statement sprinkled in my code, right? So If we wanted to, we can add even more layers of abstraction to remove the need to have if statement. So I'm talking about using something like using dependency injection or things like that to inject the right the right behavior when you need it with the flags turned on or off. But that's a little bit more advanced. If you want to just start jumping into feature flags, just start with an if statement because it just flat out works. Right? All right. The next point that I want to make is that it is vital that when you write your flags, that you have the ability to write unit tests as well, right? So if you're doing DevOps at speed, you understand how important and how vital having good unit tests are. So to give you a little bit of perspective, every developer check-in on the VSTS team has to go through a pull request. And during that pull request, it's going to automatically build for you, and it's going to automatically run our L0 and L1 unit tests, which is our fastest running unit tests. And on average, every day, we have about 600 or 700 pull requests happening every day. And each pull request has to go through, the last time I looked, it was over 70,000 unit tests. Every developer check-in has to pass 70,000 unit tests, right? That's how we are able to maintain quality and how we can guarantee that our code is, I guess you can't guarantee, but how we can have enough confidence in our code and the quality of our code so that we can ship multiple times per day. Right? So feature flags does help with the ability of moving quickly, but it adds debt, which means you have to make sure you add unit tests for your feature flags as well. And you want to have your unit tests testing both with the flag on and also with it off as well. So if you look in the left-hand pane, my left-hand pane, this is my unit tests where I browse to my home page. Notice I have, for every action that I'm doing, I have two results that I'm testing, one with the flag off and one with the flag on. So with a simple one, my page loads with all advocates. This just loads my normal page. So I'm just saying, you know what, I'm going to load the normal view. But if I turn the flag on, I'm going to make sure that I load with the new view name, right? And I also do some different logic when I'm loading up the new page as well. So if I'm loading up, I need to make sure that I call get all advocates with web presence, and I call this one time, right? But if I only call with the old UI, I have another test with it turned off where I don't call get all advocates with the new UI. I use an older call, and I check for that as well, right? So when you have flags, you have to test them on the on position and the off position, and you need to write your unit tests both for the on position and for the off position as well. So once again, this right here is basically it. Feature flags, nothing more than an if statement. Super, super easy to do. But it does incur debt because now you have all these new branches within your code. And I don't mean code branches, but logical branches like if statements. So you have to make sure that you clean your code up correctly. So to do that, we have some best practices. So let's take a look at them. Let me jump back to my slide. All right, so best practices, one of them is name your flags carefully. Right? And the reason is because there are basically two types of flags that you're going to have. One is a temporary flag where you're hiding a new feature behind that flag, and after you test it out enough and after it's been in the wild for long enough, eventually you're going to go ahead and delete that flag. You're going to clean it up, right? So those are temporary flags. So what I like to do is I like to prepend it with a temp with the name of the flag itself. So this way, when I'm looking for my flags to clean up, it's much, much, much easier to look and find them. Another type of flag is a permanent flag that stays in your code for practically ever, right? So where would you use a permanent flag? We use this a lot for user configurable features, right? So in VSTS, I have the ability to go into my profile and I can select to turn on certain features on and off, right? So those are the type of flags that are going to be sticking around forever. So then I prepend them with perm, so I know don't delete this, right? So it's easier for me to jump to the group, the temporary group, to find the ones that I need to clean up. So very important to use a good naming scheme for your flags. And you don't have to use exactly this. It just needs to be consistent, and you need to come up with a scheme that makes sense. Another best practices, and we covered this a little bit earlier, is unit test, right? Every test that touches a flag needs to have 2 tests. One for when the flag is on, one for when the flag is off. The other thing is, do name your tests so that they're easily identifiable. Because remember, creating the tests, creating the flags, super easy. What's hard is when you have to go in and clean up your flag. Right? So you want to name it so that if you do have to search for it, it's super easy to search and find all instances that touches this flag so that you can clean the code up. So name your test in a way where it's easily identifiable. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was, or the next best practices that I wanted to share was, how do you clean up your flags, right? So what I like to do is, and once again, you don't have to do it this way. We're not even required to do this in Microsoft. This is just how I do it personally, because it has helped me manage my cleanups in a much easier fashion. So I usually create a feature flag when I'm getting user story assigned to me. I create a branch for myself to work in, and I hide my feature behind that branch, and I'm code behind the branch, or I'm sorry, behind the feature flag. And right before I do a pull request to go back into master, I create a branch off of my feature, and I name it cleanup dash whatever the flag name is, right? And even before I do my pull request, or right before I do my pull request, I go into this cleanup branch that I just created, and I go in there and I do all of my cleanup work. So the reason why I do that is because at that point in time, I just coded up this feature. I know exactly where I need to go to clean up my code. Right? If I wait a week, there's no guarantee that I still remember what I've done. So much happens within a week. There's no telling where my mind's been at. I don't know if I'm going to remember everything that I've done. If it's been 2 weeks, get out of here. There's no way I can possibly remember all the places that I've changed. But if I do it immediately, clean up immediately in this branch, much, much easier to do. So when the change hits master, you're ready to go. And when it is time to clean up this branch, when we finally want to say, you know what, let's turn this branch, or I'm sorry, let's turn this feature into a permanent feature, we can remove it from the flag. All I have to do is go into launch darkly, which holds my flags, to delete that flag. And then I just merge this cleanup branch into master and pray for that. I'm done. It's literally that simple. Well, almost that simple. It's a little bit trickier because you do need to go, because this cleanup branch is a longer living branch, you need to merge from master all the time. So you need to make sure that your cleanup branch is, you merge from master and merge the latest code from master into that cleanup branch all the time, and definitely before you merge back into master. And every time you do that, potentially there's going to be code conflicts that you have to clean up and fix and do all that good stuff. But that's just part of the maintenance. But it's super important to clean up. This right here is a system that works really well for me in terms of cleaning up my code. All right. And finally, I wanted to talk about best practices for database changes, because our code is not just code, it's often code plus database as well. So a lot of times people ask me, how do you handle your database changes using something like feature flags? Or can you even use feature flags around your databases? And the answer is, yes, you absolutely can. So the first thing that I would suggest is if you are not using a database project of some sort, and by that I mean the schema of your database is checked into source control right alongside your source, use one, because that simplifies things tremendously. So if you're writing .NET code, or not even .NET code, but if you're using SQL Server, you can use SQL Server data tools, and it's called a database project, where it literally encapsulates the schema of your database, and you get to check that in right alongside your source code. If you don't want to use SQL Server data tools, or maybe you want to use the Redgate tools, maybe you're using the Oracle database or something else. Yeah, Redgate has a great set of tools that does the same type of stuff as well, where you can check in your schema, you can check in the changes to your schema, and so on and so forth. And of course, with the Redgate tools, you even have the ability to do state-based, and also migrations-based. So you can say from migration 1 to migration 2, make sure you run these scripts to move my data around, so on and so forth. Right? So it's super powerful. I'm a big fan of the Redgate tools as well. But regardless of which tool you want to use, if you use some type of database project that encapsulates your schema, it makes things much easier. You don't have to, but it does make your world easier. All right. The next thing that you need to do is you need to make sure that whatever schema changes that you make for a specific feature, the changes need to work with both the flags on and with the flags off as well. Because remember, at runtime, you can turn these flags on and off. So what that means is if I can turn this flag on or off at will, I can't introduce breaking changes to my schema, right? So for instance, if I delete a column, I can't really delete that column until I'm ready to retire this flag, right? Because I potentially can turn the flag off. So what that means is I need to deprecate the column somehow and add my new column. And also, anytime data touches one of these columns, I need to make sure I update both of the columns. Right? So I have to update the data for both with the state off and on so that I'm able to flip my switches really easily, right? And doing it this way, I'm able to flip my switch on or off whenever I need to, or however I need to. For most people, this is good enough. On the VSTS team, with our features switching that we do, we actually introduce something a little bit different as well, or a little more. We do all of this, but we also have the ability where anytime we access the database, we query the database to see what version it's at, because based on the version of the database schema, that can enable or disable certain features as well. Right? And by doing that, we can deploy our web tier, our data tier, our microservices at whichever order that we want to, and it totally doesn't matter, and everything will just run with no downtime whatsoever. But it does add some complexity. But for us, that's a small price to pay to have the flexibility of A, no downtime, and being able to deploy at any order that we want. And the last thing, and the most important thing, is you have to remember when you clean up your switches, you need to clean up your database switching as well. And that's super, super important. So that right there is what I wanted to show you guys and talk to you guys about with feature switching. So some recap: feature switching, it's nothing more than a glorified if statement with some abstractions and other things that you can make it more complex. But at the end of the day, feature switches is nothing more than an if statement. Super easy to get started. Your app doesn't need to be in any special state. You can get started today on your very next feature. And it does add complexity. So why would you want to do this? Because it enables you to move at such a faster rate. It's so incredibly important. Oops, somebody just had a question come in here, I just noticed. Do you create a cleanup branch to keep your feature and a different cleanup branch to remove the feature? No, usually what I have is a cleanup branch to a cleanup branch that will remove the switch, but will enable the feature. The feature will then be permanently enabled. Right? So the way that we use feature switching is usually Um, the switch is for a new feature. It's a temporary switch, and we enable it or disable it depending on how many people are using it. And then if we decide to turn it permanent, that's when we flip the switch. And it's not even when we decide to turn it permanent. It pretty much always is eventually going to be permanent. It's just when we're ready for it to go permanent. So because of that, I only have one branch. Oh, a second question. Can you go into how to do the switching in database in more detail, particularly the versioning comment, or possibly do a later talk on this? Yes, so the answer is I can go into this, the database switching. We don't nearly have the time to go into it because it's a lot more complicated. So I can do a future version just talking about how we handle databases and do a deeper dive into it. But if you think about it, the logic is anytime you do a data access, right? You, instead of just saying grab the data, you first ping the database to get what version it is. And based on that version, that the versioning of the database can help determine what switches to turn on and what database logic to call as well. Right? So that's the general gist of it. But like I said, we can definitely jump in and do a deeper dive on a future session. So that's it for feature switching. It's incredibly useful. So use it, start using it. I've run into people that often tell me, well, I would like to, but I don't know if I can get permission. And it puzzles me because I'm like, I don't even know why you would need permission. Do you need to ask your boss if you can add an if statement? Because I'm pretty sure your boss doesn't care about it. Just add the if statement. And you know what? The added bonus is all of a sudden now you can turn this feature on and off. You can roll this one specific feature in and out of your deployments without doing brand new deploys, right? And then you can start slowly migrating away from really complex branching schemes into much easier branching schemes that can get you moving much faster. So if you want more info on feature flags, feel free to go to https://cda.ms/js. That links to a bunch of articles that talk about feature switching. And if you have questions at all, feel free to ping me. And you can ping me on Twitter. You can reach my blog at ablesquidhead.com. Easiest and fastest way to reach me is definitely by Twitter. If you email me, I probably won't see your email for about 2 or 3 months because I'm that far behind and I'm that slow. But if you tweet at me, I see it pretty much immediately. And if I don't respond within 24 to 48 hours, I'm going to steal a joke from Damian Brady, a friend of mine. If I don't respond in 24 hours, please call my wife because something really bad happened to me, right? Because I'm on Twitter all the time. But that's it for feature flags. Start using them, people, and thank you all very, very much.
Thank you so much, Abel. That was a fantastic presentation. We really appreciate it. And thank you for attending live. If you check the Meetup site, Microsoft DevOps User Group, again, you'll see the links to the YouTube recording of all of the past presentations. So give us a little bit and we'll get the recording of this up so you can share with your colleagues and just send them a link directly to the Meetup group and they'll be able to watch the recording as well as go back and look at the recordings. We had Donovan Brown last month. We had Brian Harry in January. We had Damian Brady. And also we had at the first meeting yours truly talking about the model of implementing DevOps. So we have some great content coming up later in the year. Check the calendar. And as always, this user group will be a free venue, virtual. We do it cloud style. And so get the word out. Again, we're almost 200 group users just in this short period of time. So it proves that the DevOps uptick in the Microsoft community is very strong. So again, I'm your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and thank our corporate sponsor for the user group, ClearMeasure, and we'll hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you guys very much.